Well, good morning, folks. It is honestly a beautiful October day. I love this. So I hope you guys have had a chance to go out either with clients or by yourself over the weekend, enjoy some of the beautiful weather. It is not often that in early October we can enjoy under 100-degree temps, which has been quite fun. It is a Tuesday, which means it is Tuesday Training and Tactics. I am continuing on the theme that I started a couple of weeks ago on our purchase contract 2025 and addendums, having the discussion with your buyers on what these documents mean before they're signing them. Again, it's really important. It is before they're signing them. You should be going over your contract documents so that they understand what they're signing. It never fails that when you are in the middle of having to put a contract together, that all of a sudden, you're pressed for time. They've got to get it in. You've got only a few minutes to get it out, which means you're just emailing it to them, asking them to sign it and send it back. Then you're trying to play catch up, going over what they've signed. So we've already done the purchase contract. We did the seller compensation addendum. And today we are going to start talking about a couple of other documents. How about the HOA condominium planned community addendum? How many of you knew that that actually had both of those words in there? HOA addendum and the planned community addendum. I bet most of you did not. Then the lead-based paint and that buyer contingency addendum. We'll see if I can get through all of those today. That's my goal. I'm going to make sure my phone is on silent because otherwise I'm liable to get a bunch of calls. As we talked about, the idea today is to learn how to present the AR purchase contract and addendums confidently, okay? You need to understand what these documents mean in order to talk to your clients. To identify key sections clients must understand and recognize where legal interpretation may be required, meaning that you either need to say, look, this is something if you're concerned about, you need to talk to an attorney, or say, do you have any other questions about this? Let's delve into it further. It all depends on what it's discussing. Now, let's get into the HOA addendum. Most of us call it that way. How many of you know there are planned communities around the valley? Those planned communities have their own overlays. Who fills out the HOA addendum? Now, this is for sellers, not buyers, right? But when your buyers are dealing with, they need to know who was supposed to have filled it out. Is it the seller? Is it the agent? Is it, I don't know, somebody's sibling, spouse that isn't on the property? Hopefully it is the seller. And if you were not aware, you now can use the Breeze program to send that to your client and have them fill it out electronically. Makes it very helpful. And it should be the seller by consulting the HOA directly, not the listing agent. How many of you are guilty of that if you've taken listings, right? And they've gone ahead and done that. So this is actually from the listing side. But as the buyer, you need to discuss with your client what this information means before they are signing this, right? You've got a seller, there's an address. The HOA information on page 1 is to be completed by the seller at the time of listing the premises, right? And after it's completed, it's supposed to be loaded into the multiple listing service. That's your job as a listing agent to make sure the HOA addendum is in there. How many of us have had to call the agent and say, our buyer would like to see the HOA addendum? Oh, yeah, the seller's working on that. Property's already listed. Guess what? It's supposed to be in that MLS, right? Or it can be delivered to the buyers upon request to a prospective buyer requesting it. That's fine, but it sure would be much easier if it were already there. All right. So, couple of different things. When the buyer is looking at this is part of your conversation about planned communities, right? If they're not used to HOAs, some people say, oh, I don't want any HOAs. Then they drive around a bunch of communities that don't have HOAs and like, wow, these look a disheveled, like people aren't maintaining their yards and well, that home is, fuchsia and that one's green. And why is that? Well, because there's no HOA. Maybe I should look at an HOA. Of course, I've got that trailer that I need to park. Yeah, that's going to be tough, right? So you're looking at this and you need to look at the fact that there's an HOA name and then there's a management company. They are probably two different names, right? It may be Associated Property Management, First Management. I don't know. There are so many of them that are out there, right? Often, though, the contact information is the same. Anybody online have an idea of why the contact information is the same? Somebody want to unmute? I don't even know how many more people there were on there, but somebody want to unmute?
Self-managed.
Self-managed. So self-managed, yes, you would have the same because you don't have a management company. But why would it be the management company name and contact information and not something different for the HOA when it's a management company? Probably because the HOA is just a board and they don't field calls. They're volunteers. And so everything gets funneled through that management company. And so if you've ever have a buyer, who is supposed to be calling the HOA if they have a question about, if your buyer has a question about an HOA, a house in an HOA community, who's supposed to be calling the HOA? You? Are you supposed to make that call? Hey,
Buyer,
huh?
the
The
buyer
buyer.
should call. They should do their own due diligence and place those calls.
They should be making those calls. And one of the main reasons is if you get a hold of, I don't know, Jackie at XYZ management company, and Jackie says, "Oh yeah, that's fine. Don't worry about that. You can park that trailer out there every day. We don't care." You communicate that to the buyer. Buyer buys the property, moves in, and then reads the HOA CC&Rs later on and finds out they can't park that trailer there, right? Who are they coming after at that point? You, because you were the one that communicated the information. Because who knows, Jackie may be a temp. Jackie may have looked up the wrong information. I don't know. But you know what? If the homeowner did that and they took that information, they could go back to Jackie and they could get angry with Jackie, not you in the middle of the process. They need to make those phone calls. Now, but this is a good time to talk about what amount are dues, right? What are special assessments? Are they things that have already happened that you're paying for into the future, or are they things that are being saved for to be done in the future? Who's responsible for those assessments, the buyer or the seller, right? And oh, wait, we've got another section here. Let's talk about the fact that you can have multiple HOAs in a community, because if it was a planned area development, right? Planned community development, like Aviano at Desert Ridge. Desert Ridge is the master association. Aviano is a set of townhomes or condos that are built in the middle of this master association. So you have two sets of costs there, and they may be two separate management companies, right?
There's three.
In Anthem, there are three. In Greyhawk, there are three or four, at least, well, three. I know there are several that have three. So again, you need to know how many of those are out there. And one could have a special assessment, the other may not. And if they're calling about them, they've got to call each company separately because they're going to have different elements that are being addressed, right? So you need to have that opportunity, that time to talk to your buyer about how do HOAs impact. Now, should have had this conversation, obviously, before you're going out with people, that this is information they're going to receive. And then you're looking at an MLS sheet with them and you're going down about 3/4 down the page saying, when you're looking at these listings I'm sending you, don't just look at the top left-hand corner that says the HOA fee. You want to actually look down on the bottom right of that little block, because it says total monthly fees and it calculates if there's a master association, HOA association, one might be quarterly, one might be annually, but that little thing on the bottom right calculates it all so you know what is the total monthly impact to your client, because that's what they want to know. right? If I've got all these random HOAs, what is this going to cost me monthly? I get that some of them may be paid differently, but what is that monthly cost? Oftentimes, under the other, you will have a fee, maybe a condo cert fee that will get added in there, and that's separate from what the HOAs specifically charge as their regular set of dues. So that might be going there. So when you're looking at the second page with your buyer, again, this is how you're talking to them about this form that they're receiving. This is not the second page. I'm sorry, it's on the first page. But it's lines 17 through 21. The transfer fees associated related to the transfer of title. Now, again, there may be multiple ones of these. I usually explain to the buyer that usually the buyer pays the transfer fee. However, it is absolutely negotiable. The buyer can insist that they are not paying it. It's a part of the negotiation factor. So that's up to you to have that conversation with your client. Now, cap improvement fees, it's my understanding, we'll see if title has a different comment on this, but it's my understanding capital improvement fees started as a way, especially in the Sun Cities, to have the people moving in to have skin in the game, that they actually had money that was going in when they moved in, that was a part of the community. And for those that don't know, I think that's now $5,500 in Sun City for your cap improvements. But the point was that once they got in there, if they didn't buy into the community and have money in those reserves, if something went awry, those people were more apt to just say, not my money. I don't care what happens. I'll sue you because it's not my money. Well, all of a sudden, when they had money in the mix of that, they were less likely to be argumentative and forceful against the actual HOA itself, or in the case of those, the rec centers. But the point was that they were invested in the company or in the HOA or the community when they moved in, rather than 1 or 2 years down the road, because they don't pay much on those monthly fees, if any, in some of those retirement communities. Now, Roberta, do you have any history?
Never heard that, but I like it.
Never heard that. Okay. That's what I heard long time ago, was that was why these cap improvement fees were started. And that they were, something that was, and back then it was, $500, $600, $800. It wasn't as huge as it is today, but again, the dollar doesn't cover as much, right? So I don't know if that's true, but I do know that most times sellers do not want to pay cap improvement fees. You can get concessions out of them faster than you can get cap improvement fees. So again, it is totally negotiable. It all depends on what the seller's willing to do, and what your offer is, right? So this is, again, one of those things on those elements that your buyer needs to know they may have to pay. So just keep that in mind. Now, prepaid association fees, these are your buyers. They're prepaying, right? It's their costs. All they're doing, and this is to make them feel comfortable, all they're doing is prepaying. It is usually 2 months if it's a monthly. If it's a quarterly, it's just one payment. If it's annual, it's just one payment, semi-on one payment. So the idea is that the HOA wants to make sure that the buyer never gets behind when they're first moving in. And so it's giving the HOA 60 days to get the communication set up so that they can reach out to the new buyer, get them set up on whatever payment plan, if they're going to auto send, however they're going to set that up, or mail them the letters that they have to mail to make those payments, and they don't fall behind. That's the reason there's a prepaid association fee. It has nothing to do with trying to add more fees. They're not additional anything. It is the next set of payments simply for timing, and it is the buyer's cost. Okay. That is not, well, I'm sure you could have the seller pay it, but I don't know that anybody's ever, because it is the buyer's cost. Title. Yeah. Roberta's sitting here
Yes.
going, yes, exactly. All right.
I wanted
Yep.
to go back to capital improvement
Yep.
fees real quick. notice there are many names that it can be.
Yes.
So just because the HOA calls it working capital or community enhancement doesn't change the fact that it's still listed under that lines 18 and 19.
Yeah, and I've seen other names than these even.
Yeah.
That's just, it says including but not limited to those fees labeled as. It is whatever the fee is that is for the entire community for the project in general, not specific to that property, right? And so that's the important part. It is a community-wide fee. And so it is something that is important. It is actually something really important in a lot of HOAs. If their reserves are not there, sometimes some of the loan products are not able to be used because it will not qualify if the HOA community does not have those reserves. So I think we'll be seeing in the next year older HOAs that have not boosted their reserves are going to have special assessments to fill in and fill up those reserve accounts, because that does make a difference to the lenders. So just so you're aware of that. Disclosure fees, folks, this is Arizona law, is the seller's responsibility. I don't know if you can see that because seem to be in the way here. This is pursuant to Arizona law. Disclosure fees cannot be more than an aggregate of $400 per association. And this is state law that the seller is to pay this. See this in a different spot, but this is not negotiable. Okay. And agents, please know that it is not your job to try and trick everybody to get those disclosure fees paid by the buyer. I did actually once catch an agent telling me flat out that her title company would take care of it. They always issue the disclosure and transfer fees together, and the buyer was to pay those. And I'm like, so you're telling me you're instructing your title company to break the law? And she did not know what to answer to that. She was well, it's just, no, they don't, it's just, yeah. I'm like, well, the law says that the seller pays that. And she had set it up that the title company just ran it through that way. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's a title company I'm not going to use. So, and we did actually buy that property, but, and no, we did not pay the disclosure fee. So, folks, you need to understand, and your buyer needs to understand what this is talking about. But it's not a big deal here. It's more on the seller side. The seller, you should be explaining that to the seller. Whoops. Yep.
And I'm seeing on line 29,
Yep.
agents will put $400 and disclosure fee next to it for explain. No reason. Multiple times I've seen that.
But that
it's right above.
It already says that. You don't need that. So, and yeah, I have seen agents put that disclosures $400. As a listing agent, yes, you can make the call to verify if your seller is not doing that. I would prefer that the seller do that and fill out their form. They do often get the information. Here's the transfer and disclosure fee, and it's one number. Can always tell that because they come back and say that it's $600, and you're like, nope, can't be over 400. Oh, well, it was the transfer and disclosure fee. Yep, I need to know the two separately. So usually with my sellers, I will circle transfer fee and disclosure fee and say you need these numbers separately. When you call your HOA, you need to get both of those numbers, and they're not a single number. I think it's somebody that's just being quick on the phone and looks at the numbers and is like, oh yeah, these two are combined is $600. Like, yeah, it was 400 and 200. Oops, sorry, I forgot that. Seller certification, we're not worried about that. But guess what? It's saying the seller certifying the information is true and complete to the best of the seller's actual knowledge. Broker did not verify any of the information contained herein. Ah, look at that. They're giving you an out, but it better be a solid out, because if you go to court and the seller goes, yeah, my broker gave me that information. Really? Really? You're not supposed to do that. Okay. Here is the additional obligations. So I believe this is the top of page 2. Is that correct? It is top of page 2, which means nobody's filling anything out here. And it means this is where you as a buyer's agent are actually talking to your buyer. about what it means to live in a community with an HOA and who's responsible for things. Look, if the HOA association has less than 50 units, that means it's a tiny HOA, right? And I think, Jason, you said earlier, it's self-managed. Oftentimes, those communities that are under 50 units may be self-managed, right? The seller in this case is supposed to be the one providing the information, but I would bet that how often does title actually go after that information, even if it's under 50 units?
We can provide the CCNRs. We don't have access to bylaws, rules and regs, so if the association's not providing it, and usually those are self-managed,
Yep.
that small, we don't have access to it, so it's gotta be from the seller.
So then the seller has to get that information, and you'll see what she's talking about here in just a minute. But if the homeowners have over 50 units, the seller provides notice of pending sale, right, to the HOA. I believe that's title that actually does that on their behalf with those larger communities, right? And this is the area that gets our buyers in trouble when they're trying to do a fast close. The association is obligated by Arizona law to provide information described below to buyer within 10 days after receipt of seller notice. Now, I have heard this done several ways. I've heard it's 10 business days.
It's typically 10 calendar days,
10 calendar days. Okay, so it is 10 calendar. All right.
but because
But-
it's grade, it can take 10 business days.
Right. So the buyer's allowed 5 days after the receipt of this information to provide written notice to the seller of any items disapproved. So again, you have a client that needs to park a boat on their property, and it's a big boat, right? So they probably can't park it in front of the RV gate, but oh, look, there's a big RV gate and there's a pad behind it. No problem whatsoever, right? Well, I don't know. Better check those HOA CCNRs, Mr. Buyer, because if that boat is extending above the fence line, it could be a problem. Many HOAs have a requirement that you cannot see those things on the other side of that fence line. Now, I have seen somebody actually dig below so the boat goes down up behind the house, and I'm not recommending that, especially with 5 days of rain coming up this week. But really, that's up to the buyer, but it is something that they have to be aware of, right? So they want to park that RV. They may not be able to actually park the RV, even though they have an RV gate and an RV pad. Can't park it there because the HOA says it can't be there more than 72 hours to load up, okay? So let's take a look at these things that are required. This is where you're talking to your buyers, right? You need to let them know they should get copies of the bylaws and the rules, the CCNRs. And this came up the other day. Roberta, are there CCNRs for communities that don't have HOAs?
Yes,
Why is that? You don't know.
because it's a subdivision.
It's a subdivision.
Typically, any subdivided property has CCNRs, whether there's an HOA or not.
Right. And believe it or not, folks, these are on communities that were built in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. They may not have HOAs, but all of a sudden you will see CCNRs. They're very cute because you can see them in the old typewriter text. It has not been updated. Nobody's retyped them. They are sometimes hard to read because they've been copied.
They may be full of racist information.
That is
so the
also true.
company doesn't redact,
but it says it's not apply anymore, right? So that is very common. But it's important your buyer knows that they have the right to look at this information and need to look at some of this, right? So they should be looking at the financing of this HOA community. If it's a smaller community, pools don't cost $10,000 when they're commercial pools. So if the pool is needing an overhaul and they only have $15,000 in reserves, that's a problem, folks. That is not enough money. If it's a gated community, that gated community is responsible for paving and repaving that roadway if it's gated. The city doesn't come along and pave it. So there better be some money in reserves, and they need to look at that, right? So if there's litigation, that the litigation names of what is in pending litigation needs to be disclosed, and the amount of the lawsuit or case needs to be visible to a prospective buyer, right? And so this is when you are working with your buyer, people skip over page 2. I bet you if I asked each of you, if I put you on camera and said, how many of you actually have gone over Page 2 with your clients, with your buyers, right? Do you understand what it means to go into an HOA community and what are the risks here with regard to the financing of that community, right? If there's litigation and the HOA has to pay up, who pays?
Homeowner.
The homeowners, right? All of them collectively. If the HOA loses, all of the homeowners have to pay that bill. So you just need to look at some of that information. So please remember to share. These are a couple of the other things. And I think this is one of the most important is the current operating budget and the current financial report of the association. How much money do they have in the bank compared to what their budget is for the year, right? Do they have enough money? Or, and how much money each month are they actually putting into that reserve account? They're supposed to be putting money from every person into the reserve account. So, the buyer has to acknowledge and sign that they've received this information after they get all of that. Here is the buyer section, right? And it says that line 71 to 76 to be only completed by the buyer and not the seller. I always loved it as a buyer's agent, downloading the HOA addendum from the MLS. Thank you, it was there. And the seller had already filled out that the buyer was paying all these fees, right, in 71 to 76. So, they've already said the transfer fees are being paid by the buyer, the cap improvement fees are paid by the buyer. They are not the ones that have the right to fill those out at all. So if somebody does that, I would print a new page 3 and start over. Here is the one that has caused the most trouble since this document was revised. Any additional fees not disclosed on page 1 and payable upon close of escrow shall be paid by buyer, seller, or other. Folks, as a buyer's agent, you must have one of those 3 boxes filled in. If you don't, compliance will write you up and say, we need to know what the answer to this question is, because the problem is title doesn't know if those numbers don't match from page 1 to what is really the case, who is paying those fees. They've given us the opportunity to detail that as agents to protect our buyer. And yet our buyer agents fail to fill that in, I'd say 25% of the time. The number of times I see this not filled in is kind of staggering, actually. So please, you need to do this. And this means that if let's say it's December and the seller has put in the HOA fees, it's December, and they haven't been reading their HOA newsletters that tell them effective January 1st, the HOA is being increased by $50. Now, who should be responsible for that? The buyer or the seller? Now, you're welcome to say that the buyer is taking on that responsibility. That is all your choice, and that's your buyer's choice. But really, the seller didn't do their due diligence that things were changing in January 1st. They took the listing in November, put down the information, and nobody bothered to look at it after that. They sell the home in February, the HOA is now a different amount. That's what it's talking about additional fees not disclosed. It was disclosed, it was $250 a month, now it's $300 a month. Who is paying that difference on the initial fees? You're not going to pay the monthly difference, right? But there are prepaids. I don't know. I think I might go after the seller for those prepaid differences.
Seen that happen.
The $100 difference between what was proposed and what is now there. Of course, the buyer can cancel when they get notified that the HOA fee has changed. So listing agents, please remember, you got to update that come December, January if you've got a property in an HOA. All right. Buyer shall pay all prepaid association fees. Like I said before, those are the buyer's costs. They are using the HOA during those 2 months or whatever that they are paying for. Seller shall pay all disclosure fees as required by Arizona law. That is not up for negotiation. So then it says, in a finance purchase, buyer shall be responsible for all lender fees charged to obtain the associated management company documents. So again, if they have a condo cert fee, guess who's responsible for paying that? The buyer is. So agents, you have to make sure they understand that, because oftentimes that becomes an area of contention. Well, you didn't tell me there was a condo cert fee. Doesn't really matter. It's a part of the cost the lender has to deal with to obtain those documents, and the buyer ends up footing those bills. Now, the buyer can contact the associations for verbal verification for fees payable upon close of escrow. Okay. So, and then also if there are assessments, current homeowner association assessments, lien as of the close is paid in full by the seller. Any assessment that becomes a lien after close of escrow is the buyer's responsibility. So if there has been an assessment for something that has been done to the property, and it's something that they're allowing the buyer to pay over time, and it's a lien, then typically you need to negotiate and make sure that that is clearly laid out, but the seller should be paying those as of close of escrow. Now, if it's something that is being worked on and there are multiple payments because the work is being done in sections, it would only be what is the lien as of close of escrow that has been completed, not the future work that's being done maybe next quarter or next, 3 months, 4 months from now. That would not be a lien at close of escrow. And that's often why they divide those up into project sections. So again, something to make sure your buyer knows. Obviously, there can be additional terms, and we pretty much end this one out. I'm going to stop and take questions if anybody has any, and we'll move on to the next form if there is anything else to be said. By the way, this is another one that the brokers are supposed to sign off on. We are probably not as diligent as making sure that this is in within 72 hours, but we do flag it that it's needed. As soon as we know there's an HOA, we flag that saying that we need the HOA addendum as soon as it's signed. So questions from anybody online? Oh, do you have a question? No? No questions? All right, look, we'll move on. Getting through these. Lead-based paint. This is one of my most amusing forms. So, who fills out the lead-based paint addendum? I should probably say who fills it out first. Probably what I should say. The seller, not the listing agent, right? And first, it must be the seller. If buyer sends over the lead-based paint without the seller data, who can be fined? Somebody online, open your mic and answer that question. Is it the buyer? Is it the seller? It's you. If you are the buyer's agent and you send that form over without the seller data on there, you are racking up anywhere from $6,000 to $12,000 in fines. So please, buyer agents, do not ever send over a lead-based paint without the seller data. See, the real estate agent. Okay, so this form is, yes, drafted by the Arizona Association of Realtors, but does anybody remember from the other day who actually has created this form? That's not giving you that information, but who's created this form? What entity oversees this form and is the one that issues the fines on this form? Because it is not AAR. It is not
EPA.
NAR. Jason?
EPA.
The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. It is a federally mandated form. We have nothing to do with those fines, but if they pull your file and these have been done improperly, you can have quite the set of fines. So I just want to make sure people see that there are actually 2 forms to fill out. If you are doing rentals, if you are listing a rental property that was built prior to 1978, there is a separate form for the rentals versus sales. So just make sure you're pulling that correct form. This is talking about the lead warning. If you are working with buyers that are looking at properties built pre-78 and they've not bought homes before, first-time home buyers, please make sure that they are getting this information and getting the lead pamphlet, the lead-based pamphlet there. So the seller disclosures, there are 3 separate seller disclosures. One is that the seller is aware that there is lead-based paint or they have no knowledge of lead-based paint. The second is if they have reports about lead-based paint, that they have provided those reports. If they don't have reports, that they state that they don't have any reports about this. And by the way, I actually have had one deal in 28 years that did actually have lead-based paint, and the person handed me a whole folder. It was like, here you go. Like, wow. So it was a long time ago, but I did see it once. Seller acknowledges their obligation. This is the key, right? The seller knows that they must disclose if they are aware of any lead-based paint. That's basically the top 3 items that the seller has to disclose. The buyer then is acknowledging, and this is why the buyer cannot fill this out first, right? Buyer has read the information set above and has received copies of the reports or records. If there's nothing filled out above, they cannot answer and initial that question, right? And that's where you will be fined $1,000 for each of those initials that are filled out if that section above has not been done. It's very simple. Every initial that is done or signature done in error is on the responsibility of the agent. So if you get this to them and there's nothing filled out above, then you've got a problem. Now, I guess if you have given them the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, which is available in multiple places, AAR has it. It should be in our working docs as well, but they may have just removed that. But it is available. I'll make sure to tell you where it is later. But if they've received that, maybe they wouldn't fine you for that, but you better have proof that you've delivered that. Buyer has either received a 10-day opportunity or waived the opportunity. This is probably the number one thing that we get on this form is that neither one of those boxes is checked. Guess what? It says buyer has checked one. Who's liable if this file gets pulled by the EPA? Box not checked, it's going to be on you, right? And I'm very polite when I call people when these have been flagged and I say, I will gladly approve this document. That is up to you, but you need to understand you could be liable between $6,000 and $12,000, 1-2 buyers. How many errors do you want to cover? Maybe you need to correct your document before we close this file. So it's up to you. So agent then has to acknowledge, right, that they've completed this form, right? Agent whose initials below has ensured the seller's compliance under the residential resale thing, lead-based paint, and the seller's use and completion of this disclosure form. Guess what? Both the cooperating agent and listing agent initial there. So if you as the buyer's agent sent this over before the section 1 has been done, that's another one you're responsible for, right? And then here's the accuracy. Now, I often get on Teams, do you both need to sign? I would say it is better to be safe than sorry, that if you're on a team, if my name down is there and I've got another agent working with me, put a slash next to my name, put the other person's name, have 2 signatures, squish them on that line above. I don't care. More is better there. You've got their signatures. They can't come after you and say somebody didn't sign. Now, you don't have room for 15 people. You would never do that. But if there are 2 people on the contract, 2 agents on the contract, put them in there. If you've got 4 buyers, there better be 4 buyer signatures on here. This is the only document that must be signed on the same document. You cannot do this in counterpart, okay? It is very important that that is an EPA rule. That is not an AAR rule. It is an EPA rule that all signatures must be done on this one document, okay? So hopefully you guys all get that one right. Any questions about that? Let me back that up. Any questions on lead-based paint? All right, so let's see how we're doing on time. Ooh, might have time to do this. Okay, obviously didn't mean to have those do that. Why use a buyer contingency addendum? This is one that you as the buyer's agent really need to go over with your buyer. This is a conversation before you go look at homes. Buyer says, I'm so excited to start buying. Oh, yeah, by the way, I need to sell my home. But that's not going to be a big deal. It'll be fine, right? And you probably are the listing agents. You're like, yeah, not a big deal. Okay, you have to go over this form with your client, set those expectations, right? What are the timelines, and walk your buyer through the what ifs, the options for the buyer who must sell. Really need to have this conversation, right? So what if you don't get a buyer in time for that and you have sold your property? The home has gone on the market, you've sold your property, you can't find a home. What are the options you can do? Did you guys know we actually have language that you can put in on the purchase contract for that seller? I'm sorry, for that buyer buying another property that, I'm sorry, for the seller when they're selling their property, if they haven't found another property that they can get out of the contract that's on their property. We have language for that to help you. May or may not want to use it, but most importantly, you need to look at how realistic it is. How quickly will that property sell right now, right? Is it in pristine condition, priced right? Great. Or is it needing a ton of work? They've overpriced it. What situation are you dealing with? So keep that in mind and set those expectations with the buyer, right? In this case, who may also be selling. So that disappeared the wrong way. There you go. Buyer contingency addendum. Hello. Very simple. Starts out with seller buyer and the premises, right? Simple, simple. All right. The following additional terms and conditions are included as a part of the contract between the seller and the buyer. The terms and conditions are included herein by reference, right? So if buyer has accepted an offer to purchase buyer's property, mark the box on line 10 and complete only sections 1 and 3. If buyer has not accepted an offer to purchase buyer's property, meaning possibly they haven't even listed the property, mark the box on line 18 and complete only sections 2 and 3. Now, I just want to make note of this. This is done. This was redone in 2023. And if you guys have not used it in that time period, you may not be aware of this little thing in here, which I'm going to go over, right? Section 1, easiest part of this contract. Your buyer has put their home on the market. They have a contract to purchase. They are ready to go. That property is set to close on October 30th. Buyer has 3 days to waive this contingency by written notice to seller in the manner required in the contingency waiver provision, or this contract shall be deemed canceled and earnest money shall be released to buyer. That is if the buyer's property does not close on that date. I'm sorry. So if it doesn't close on that date, buyer can then cancel and get their earnest money back. Okay. Or they can waive their contingency and move forward. Very simple part of this. You jump to section 3, and I'm literally going to jump to section 3. Remember, early on, I said if they have an accepted offer, you start with this, you do sections 1 and section 3. So I'm going to move over to section 3 because I think a lot of people get confused. They start reading section 2 and think, oh, wait, this is going to apply. Remember, if you're talking your client through this, they should know they're under contract. Once they submit this, they're also submitting their offer documents, right? So within the time specified with the section above, so either section 1 or section 2, but section 1 is saying these are included. I'm showing you what the offer was on the sale of my home. You'd be surprised how many buyers are like, wait, I have to show them the contract I have on my home? Why would I do that? Well, because they need to know what that contract is and where it is in line and how it's moving. Is that contract contingent? Oh yeah, contingent on another one. Do we have a domino effect, right? And beyond that, what I would put on line A is that a preliminary settlement report from title is going to be provided. Because guess what? That's your client's proof of funds. If it's contingent on the sale of that home, 99% of the time, they're taking the money from that sale and moving over to what they're buying. That means it's proof of funds. And why would it be important to find out that they're selling, I don't know, a $700,000 home, but they're only getting $100,000 out of it? And you have an offer that is expecting, I don't know, a $500,000 down payment? Well, where's the other $400,000 coming from? Yeah, it might be important for you to find that out, right? And it's really important to the person that's receiving this offer to know that information. Roberta, do you get those requests a lot to get a settlement statement on a property
Yes.
that's contingent? And you have no problem sending that to the client. Do you send that to the other side, or does it always go through the client's agent?
With their approval.
Okay, so there you go. So, and again, I think that that's something personally, if it's my buyer writing this offer, I'm trying to get that settlement statement and include it with this package. Now, sometimes you may not have that preliminary settlement statement yet because the title company hasn't gotten in touch yet with the lender to find out what the payoff is. So you need it to have that payoff information, right? It doesn't make sense if it's being sent out saying, oh yeah, they've got, you know, XYZ, because title can't show that they have that. If they know that there's a loan, they have to find that loan information. So cancellation. So let's say that the buyer's accepted offer cancels. Buyer has to deliver notice to seller within 3 days of the receipt of cancellation and provide the evidence of the cancellation. Notice to the seller shall state buyer's election to 1, immediately cancel, or proceed forward by waiving the contingency. There is a form for that. You need to get the contingency waiver provision form and pull that out, okay? But your buyer needs to understand what happens if the contract they have all of a sudden falls out. Usually a lot of buyers, if they're going to put their home on the market first, which I love, right? They want to get through the inspection period and appraisal and know that that buyer is now locked down. Pretty hard for them to cancel. They can, but not a good thing for them to do, right? So you want to make sure that the buyer is understanding that. So here is the contingency waiver. I actually can't see that. Provision. So if at any time the buyer elects to waive the buyer contingency and proceed with this contract, buyer has to provide documentation from their lender that they can close by the close of escrow date without that sale, or if it's an all cash sale, that they have the ability to close by COE without the closing of the buyer's property, right? So if buyer elects to waive the buyer's contingency and proceed with the contract, they agree that all other contingencies in the contract shall remain the same. These are the conversations you're having with your buyer before you write this offer. They need to understand this because they may decide in just a second they want their home under contract first, rather than the risk that's associated if they don't have it under contract. So here's the thing that is confusing people. Contract time periods. The date of contract acceptance for purposes of all applicable contract time periods, excluding the opening of escrow and deposit of earnest money, shall deem to be either the date the contract was signed and any incorporated counteroffer is delivered to and received by the appropriate broker as indicated in Section 8I of this contract. Now, that to me lines up with Section 1, the buyer is already under contract on their property. This second one, which says 3 days after seller's receipt of buyer's accepted offer documents, provided that the seller does not cancel this contract prior to expiration of the 3-day period, which I'll show you in just a second, or again, the buyer waives the buyer contingency pursuant to Section 2. Okay. There's a 3-day period here that I'm going to explain in just a minute. If you have not seen this document in 2 years, this is what's new. But in terms of contract time period, my recommendation, if you are using Section 1 and the property is already under contract, you need those time periods to begin immediately and start proceeding, because the 3-day period does not apply in that case. You're under contract if everybody accepts this. So Failure to deliver notice, I'll go over this in the end. That's where I'm showing what you should be doing. Again, the box on 63 for section 1. Let's go look at section 2. And this is where people are running into a problem with their buyers because they're not explaining this, okay? This is contingent on an accepted offer, right? It's not under contract yet. And it says that the seller is going to allow the buyer to move forward. The buyer's property is not for sale yet, or not under contract yet, at least, right? And it is to go under contract no later than now, let's say November 19th, right? Under contract. If buyer does not accept an offer on buyer's property by the date set forth on line 21, buyer has 3 days to waive the buyer contingency. So that's 20, 21, 22, right? By written notice in the manner required by the contingency waiver provision, and contract time periods shall commence, or this contract shall be deemed canceled and earnest money released to the buyer. Not a big deal. This should be something you're explaining on a contingency. This is what it means. The buyer has a set a time. Why would you put November 19th? Right? How long are properties sitting before they're going under contract? You're looking at your comps. You're going back and looking in this area, homes of similar styles, they've been going under contract within 10 days, within 20 days, within 30 days. You're actually clicking the history on those contracts that are under contract now and those that have sold. What was that time period? This is not a random guess, folks. Use the information at your fingertips. Pull that data out there. Well, most homes are going under contract. Let's give ourselves enough time. Oh, we're heading into the holidays. Maybe it might take a little longer because we're heading into the holidays. Maybe buyers aren't going to be interested in buying right now. But interest rates may be dropping. So maybe that'll speed it up. But let's give our buyer an opportunity. Let's give them that chance. So you're going to stretch this out a little bit, right? So 11/19, that's fine. Again, if it doesn't close, doesn't get an offer, buyer needs to understand they either have to cancel or they have to waive that contingency. Can they do that? Sometimes they can. They don't want to, right? They can pull money out of their IRA, but it's going to cost them. Do they want to do that? So next, accepted offer for buyer's property. The buyer accepts an offer. They got it, right? Buyer shall deliver the accepted offer documents to the seller for the seller's review within 3 days or blank days after the execution of the accepted offer. You're thinking, whew, we're in the clear, right? Not a problem at all. We got that offer. We're under contract. And then lines 28 and 29 are here to wreck your day. Seller may, within 3 days of receipt of accepted offer documents, cancel this contract and the earnest money shall be released to the buyer. Your buyer is under contract now to sell their home, and they just lost the property that they've been sitting on for 45 days, and it's gone. If you will notice that this says, cancel this contract. For a reason? They decide they don't want to sell anymore because they have a backup offer, doesn't actually say. The seller may, within 3 days of receipt, cancel this contract. Earnest money goes back to the buyer. Congratulations. Who is going to be having a heart attack at this point? Your buyer. Okay? Now, you can try to negotiate and remove lines 28 and 29. I understand the reason that our associates wrote this in there. I understand why realtors put this in there. Think about it. When you do this using section 1, you're delivering with this offer that entire contract. The seller gets the right to see, is it a domino, right? Is the buyer of that property a VA buyer? Is it an FHA buyer? Is it an investor? Is it, somebody, again, domino to somebody else? Are they only putting 3% down? They putting 50% down? The seller gets all that information before they accept your offer. They get the right to review that. But When you're in the middle of the contract, all of a sudden you deliver your accepted contract on your property, and the seller had no rights to say, oh, heck no, I don't want to go down the road with this. You know, they're putting 3% down. It's contingent on another offer that's only putting 3% down. I'm like, you start going to those dominoes. How many dominoes do you want, right? The seller has no right to say, wait a minute, I don't want this. And the problem is, right, how do they write this that the seller can cancel if this, then that, because of this, maybe this? They couldn't qualify that. So they just said seller has the right for 3 days to cancel the contract. Who is the one that is going to be angry with you as the buyer's agent? Your buyer, if it cancels. So they need to understand that risk is in there. If you're not explaining that risk before you allow a buyer to sign this document and they are not under contract, they have to understand that 3-day risk. And there is nothing you can do about it. There's nothing I can do about it. There's nothing the other broker can do about it. The seller has the very clear right to cancel the contract for no reason whatsoever, period. So it's your job before you allow a buyer to write a contingent offer to understand Section 2, this 3 days could blow everything up, even if you've worked on this file for 45, 60, 75 days, depending on how long you make that contingency. So please understand that. So again, can you cross that out? You bet. Does the seller have to accept it? Nope. Will they? Maybe they will. It's up to you and your buyer, but they need to understand the risk factor, okay? If buyer accepts an offer on their buyer's property and fails to deliver the accepted offer documents to seller within the time period, seller can issue a cure notice as required by 7A of the contract. And in the event of buyer's breach, seller is entitled to the earnest money pursuant to 7B. Pretty simple on that. You really, if you have anything that is with a contingent offer, you have to be watching these time periods like a hawk, because if you fail to meet them, then the whole deal falls apart, right? So if seller does not cancel the contract within 3 days of receipt of accepted offer documents, the contract becomes contingent upon closing by XYZ date. There are always 2 dates that get written in there. The date is the offer acceptance and then the date of closing, right? And like I said, if the pending sale does not close by the escrow date, right, the date noted on line 34, buyer has 3 days to waive the contingency, or this contract shall be deemed canceled and the earnest money released to the buyer. But you need to be aware that that time frame is in there, right? That they've got to get that, but everything has to follow within those time frames, or you need to send out addendums to change those dates. Seller acceptance of a backup contract. None of this says that the seller can't accept a backup contract, right? So this does disclose that if the seller has accepted a subsequent offer, backup contract, to purchase the premises before the buyer has delivered to the seller and accepted offer documents, the seller may deliver written notice informing the buyer of the backup. Upon receipt, buyer shall have 3 days or X number of days to waive their contingency, or the contract shall be deemed canceled and earnest money released. So basically the seller has another out. If they get another offer, they can force the buyer to act or they're done. So again, that's 2 opportunities the seller has. Normally, our contract does not give the seller an opportunity to cancel on a buyer. Here you have 2 separate circumstances where the seller absolutely can cancel on the buyer. So please be aware of that. Again, things you need to explain to your client. Now you go back over to additional terms. I would be adding that settlement statement in there when you've got that package, the contract. So, and again, we go down to contract time periods, and you'll see I've checked this second box. To me, this is when you check this second box, right? Because if the buyer has 45 days to go under contract, why would you want the contract time periods to begin before you have that contract to actually sell the home and be moving forward on this deal. That's why this 3-day after seller's receipt, because of course, if the seller's going to cancel on you, you don't want to start your inspections, right? You don't want to hire the inspector on day 2 and have the seller on day 3 say, yeah, I'm canceling. Because again, for any reason, they can cancel. So that's where I would use line 65, okay? And then failure to deliver notice. This again, we went over this. And finally, the signatures. And we have come to 11 o'clock. How about that for timing? I'm going to stop sharing. I am going to stop my recording. Do that.